Order, order. Welcome to this morning's session. This is the third and penultimate session of our Buses Connecting Communities inquiry, and today we'll be questioning regional transport leaders and experts. In our first panel, we're looking at franchising and its potential before turning into considering the effectiveness of enhanced partnerships model in our second panel. And of course, we're particularly focusing on buses in rural and edge of urban area provision. So could I ask the first panel to introduce themselves?
Thank you, Chair. My name's Vidler. I'm Chief Executive of the Confederation of Passenger Transport. We're the trade association for UK's bus and coach sector.
Good morning, I'm Stephen Rhodes. I'm the Director of Bus at Transport for Greater Manchester, now running a fully integrated franchise network. Thank you.
I'm Martin Dean. I'm Managing Director of Go Ahead's UK Regional Bus Division and also Chairman of CPT, so work very closely with Graham.
Good morning, I'm Judith Barker. I'm the Executive Director for Place and Connectivity at Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority, and we took the Mayor took the decision to move to franchising on the 7th of February, so this journey is very new to us.
Thank you very much. So several areas are exploring franchising, and Greater Manchester, as you say, has implemented it. So what are the main factors driving local authorities to considering bus franchising as an operating model? I'll go from left to right again.
I think it's really important to distinguish between different types of franchising, and it's very simple to think that the options are, on the one hand, a commercial bus market where the local authority has little or no control, and on the other, the London model, or indeed now the Manchester model, where the local authority controls pretty much everything. What I expect we'll see in future is more local authorities looking at different shades of franchising rather than simply comparing those two extremes, if you like. And what increasingly we'll see local authorities doing as the Bus Services Bill passes into law is asking themselves questions like, do I need to franchise some or all of my area, maybe just a few routes, maybe just a town or city within my area? Do I need to take on full responsibility for revenue risk, or can I share it with operators? Do I need to specify every aspect of the network, or can I set the minimum standards and let operators build on top of that? Do I need to own the buses and own the depots, or can I leave those in private sector hands? So I think we're about to move into a much more sophisticated phase of considering franchising, where local authorities will compare the enhanced partnerships they already have against a range of options, and that will accelerate once the bill becomes law later this year.
Thank you, it's useful.
Thank you. So our journey to franchising has been a long one. We, in that process, looked very closely at various partnership approaches as well. The key requirement from a Greater Manchester perspective is driven by customer expectations, requirements, and particularly for an integrated, easy-to-use public transport system, so not just about buses. We see franchising as an enabler in that sense, and I think the best way of demonstrating that, which is really up to date, is that this Sunday just gone, we've just implemented Tap and Go contactless with capping payments across bus and the Metrolink system. That would not have been possible otherwise unless we'd franchised the network. So within 2 to 3 months of franchising, the final of the 3 stages being implemented in Greater Manchester, we've put that measure in. But it is very much about delivering for customers with clear accountability, clearly for the Mayor. As the Director of Bus, I don't escape that accountability as well. So we are really positive about this. We're seeing some really good results coming through that I'm sure we'll talk about as part of the ongoing discussion. But it's a good place to be in now in terms of delivering and starting to deliver improvements. We always did say that it will take many years to fully realise those benefits. This is not all about quick wins, albeit the expectations now are understandably that we make improvements and do that quickly. And we're doing that, but it will take a long time to fully realise all of those benefits. But we're on that road there. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin.
Thank you. I think from an operator point of view, Go Ahead, we've run a lot of networks in communities for a long time, so we'd like to think that we understand what our customers want. We've also, as an operator, we run around 6,000 buses in England, and around sort of 2,500 of those are in London. So we already run in a very regulated environment, and then lots of services outside. We also run in Singapore and Australia and Sweden. So we're used to doing regulated and deregulated. I think to answer your question, Chair, the reason that some local authorities are looking at moving towards franchising is that where there's things like fixed track systems, complicated urban areas, need for economic growth, there's a desire for maybe more of a controlling mind in the Transport Authority. But I agree with Graham that there's a whole range of options available, and I think as we move forward, it could be that the major metropolitan areas see franchising as the way forward, as Mr. Rhodes has mentioned for TFGM. But there could be a range of other options in other areas, as Graham's mentioned, we might explore.
Thank you. So obviously we completed our public consultation in the autumn of last year. So we've spent a lot of time articulating what the benefits and the considerations are in franchising. So we have a bus strategy that was agreed in 2021, and that had 4 key areas: to enhance and have an integrated network, to have bus services that contribute to economic, social and environmental goals, to be able to coordinate services, ticketing, stabilise services and offer better information, and finally to maximise value for money. And the conclusion of our assessment was the only way that we can deliver that is through the franchise model. And so those are the benefits that we're trying to achieve through going through the franchising plan. And I think there's 2 really critical things that came out in the board meetings and the committee meetings. There's a real desire to have a network that responds to the public good, and that delivers for the communities in those areas, that's coordinated, but also to allow the cross-subsidy. And Graham mentioned the model of a whole or a part. One of the critical parts of our model is to have the whole area to enable the profit-making parts of the urban areas to subsidise the rural areas. So that cross-subsidy is key, and therefore the whole area for us was key.
Okay, thank you. And don't feel from now on you all have to answer every question. So, but obviously, if you've got anything specific to add. So, my next question is: what are the greatest risks for local authorities in transitioning to franchising? And I think you've sort of touched on a couple of mitigations, but what are the greatest risks? Because obviously, other areas are looking at other models. Yeah, come in. Because
again, there's been a real focus, as you can imagine, through the consultation period on the risks for the local authority, because it is a very large step to take, and a 30-year business plan is very challenging. Clearly, when we have annual funding and we have to plan and prepare an assessment over a 30-year period to 2054. So I think the key risks for us are around that annual financial settlement and needing to plan in the longer term. Clearly, if we lost government funding over that period, that is a risk. There's also the operational income, the fare box, which might be subject, nationally. There's obviously a reduction in numbers of passengers. That isn't what's happening in our area, but it is a risk. There's also a risk that the tender prices come in higher than we have budgeted for, which then means would we be at risk at needing to deliver a reduced service, which clearly is not the ambition of the Mayor. I think the final risk I'd draw out would be about the costs of the depot, which clearly is significant, particularly in a high land value area as ourselves. I think if I may just add one other factor, which we have seen, we have retained the fare cap at £2 since the government changed it to £3, but we are concerned that there's some anecdotal evidence in some areas that has led to a reduction in passengers, and we are concerned about the risk that might have in our planning going forward. Okay, thanks. Scott, you had you may be about to answer Scott's question.
Thank you, Chair. So I think risk to local authorities is a really important thing to consider, because it's, the voters there have got their key stakeholders. But Graham, what are your members saying about the risks to them as operators that could come with franchising?
So I'd flag probably three additional risks to the ones that Judith has already pointed out. One of them is the risk of distraction, and that while an authority and its operators are preparing for the transition to franchising, people get distracted from all of the bus service improvements that could be made within the enhanced partnership. So it's really important that the partnership that exists remains strong and remains focused on passenger improvements during that period. Secondly, there is the risk that public expectations are raised a little too high. And it's quite easy, I think, for the nuance of the very careful assessments that have been made in Manchester and Cambridge and Peterborough and elsewhere to be lost behind this sort of public sentiment that we're going to change the buses, therefore the buses will get better. And as Stephen said, it's not an overnight magic trick. It takes time and it takes money. And thirdly, and probably most directly salient to my members, is the risk that SMEs get squeezed out of the market completely, because many franchising processes are very complicated, very complex, very time-consuming, and it can be a deterrent to smaller businesses who've been operating in the area for many years to compete. And we're really worried about how local authorities will work with us to manage that risk going forward.
Stephen, yes.
So, interestingly, in our position, obviously, those are exactly the sorts of things that were thought about in many cases some years ago from a Greater Manchester perspective. Particularly, though, the risks of not franchising, which were really very significant in terms of a rising cost to prop up uncommercial services, therefore being unable to take a holistic view that Judith talked about, which I think hasn't materialised. I also just wanted to talk briefly about the operator side of this. Clearly, a lot of effort goes into working with incumbent operators, particularly in our case through a lengthy transitional period, well over a year between the first and the last franchise. And that's important. Great focus went into managing that transition. But interestingly, we had a very healthy amount of competition, both in terms of numbers of bidders throughout our three tranches, and also in terms of their quality and quantity of submission. So we're very alive to that. Funding will always be an issue for the sector, for all of us in whatever regulatory model that we've got. But we've come through, I think, initially that other side without any of those very significant risks materialising, and actually feel that for putting in subsidy into the network almost inevitably, but we're able therefore to control and influence things, as I've just said with fares, for example, to a much greater way than was previously the case.
Okay.
Just one other thing to add. I agree with all those things that colleagues have said. I think the other thing to bear in mind is risk to the workforce as well, because when we're all talking about the possibility of franchising and things changing to our frontline colleagues, that could be really disruptive. You know, will I still be paid the same hourly rate? What's going to happen to my pension? Will I be working from the same garage? Will I be driving the same route? So that sort of thing, everybody, which we did, Stephen, you know, everyone needs to put a lot of effort into to make sure that you over-communicate during those times to settle people and to make sure that everybody is feeling okay about their jobs, because the sector has obviously been one where there has been some shortage in the past. It's good to say that now we seem to be over that. That was a post-COVID thing for a couple of years, where we were short of drivers, and so it's really important that when we're talking about franchising, that's not interpreted as something that will cause a lot of uncertainty and disruption for our driver colleagues.
While we're talking about risk, Steph, you had quite an important question.
Specifically to Judith, I think about the consultation you've just done, which is obviously you've just completed that public consultation. I'm interested in what it's told you so far, in particular about passenger expectations, but also about local travel patterns. Has it revealed anything to you on those fronts?
So we had we had a consultation period that was open for 14 weeks, and during that period we had a series of kind of face-to-face, as well as you would expect, the kind of online questionnaires. And the nature of the questionnaires is very directly about the impact of the choice around franchising or an enhanced partnership, and kind of comparing the two, and asking people to provide us feedback on those points. But obviously, as you can imagine, the depth of the conversations that happened in the public meetings and also in the focus groups that we held was actually much more wide-ranging than that. So we had 1,653 submissions back, of which there was a really wide set of comments. And some of those were picking up some of the issues that we're talking about today. So some of the key issues we mentioned about access to the market for small and medium-sized businesses. We did a lot of work with our bus operators forum and operators more widely. We have 11 operators, one large operator and 10 smaller operators in our area. And they were giving us feedback both on the business case overall, the proposition, but also specific things. So they were asking us, for instance, could we extend the proposals for mobilisation periods to make sure that there's longer to prepare for perhaps a bigger contract than they're used to doing. They were also asking for clarity around the lotting strategy. How many lots are we going out, over what time period? What support will there be for them to be able to learn procurement? Because small businesses aren't geared up in the same way necessarily to do that. Other things that were coming up, in particular, we had a lot of attendance at the meetings from rural areas who were concerned about the connectivity and saying, well, it's all very well to franchise, but if we haven't got a bus anyway, how are we going, how's this going to change it for us? So we were able to talk to them about our demand responsive travel and how that might work, and how to say about evaluating that, so that they were able to talk about that. People were also highlighting issues about reliability and frequency, and particularly asking us, if it's under contract, what clauses will we have in the contract to be able to enforce, to ensure that the reliability is better than it is now. So overall, it was really wide-ranging, it was really rich, and one of the commitments we've made is to make sure we build on that engagement that we've done, not only during the kind of transition period, but on an ongoing basis, because it's really rich information that we've got from it.
Thank you.
Okay, I think, does that address your question about SMEs in the sector?
Well, it was just a question for Mr. Vidler briefly, based on what you were saying about SMEs potentially being squeezed out. Please do correct my ignorance, but the impression one gets of the bus sector is that it is largely dominated by Stagecoach, First Group, Go Ahead, etc. Generally running monopolies in the areas concerned. But again, please do correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, so there are 5 major operating groups in England who have around about 80% of the market outside of London. It's very rare for there to be a monopoly or a near monopoly. When you get a monopoly, it tends to be a municipally run bus company, such as in Warrington or Reading or Ipswich. And what you tend to find in most markets is you will have 1 or 2 of those larger operators and some smaller local businesses who provide services in addition to those. So most markets are quite mixed, in fact.
I have to say, wherever I've lived, that's definitely not been the case, and I've lived in a wide range of places, but maybe I've lived in unusual places.
I can certainly provide some further evidence to the committee if that would be helpful.
So I think our experience so far in terms of SME engagement has been probably quite mixed. The Greater Manchester market had consolidated, so there weren't very many incumbent SMEs remaining for franchising. However, we quite purposefully constructed a number of our small franchises right around the 3 tranches of Greater Manchester in a way to suit the SME sector. In other words, we constructed smaller contracts that were not a lot different in their sort of geography and extent to some of the previous subsidised bus contracts. We found it very difficult. We did an awful lot of engagement, I suppose, going the extra mile, which is fine, to try to meet with and engage with and encourage and explain some of the background to that. We have got one SME operator. It's a schools operator in our first tranche to the north of Greater Manchester. I suppose I just wanted to draw out that inevitably there's a procurement factor here. There's a need to have a level playing field. I think that does need saying. And another factor is that we are trying to get consistent standards. So that's also very important in terms of something that, whether that be a small or a larger operator, is really important. When we do our reprocurement, and interestingly we're just starting that for our first franchises in the tentative first steps already, we're going to be looking at this issue again because, as I said, I think we'd like to do better. But there's probably a need there for the sector in some way, maybe with CPT help, to help enable being able to have conversations with authorities such as ours, because many of those operators have bid successfully for tendered bus contracts before, not franchises, but they've done something similar. So it's a bit strange that we I think so far have found it difficult to engage. But perhaps just to finish on my comment of, in Greater Manchester latterly, there were probably 3 or 4 meaningful sized SME operators. So unless we're talking about bringing new SME operators in, which is a possibility, that sector has reduced over time.
Okay. Rebecca, you've been trying to get in.
Just on the 2 things we've just been discussing, I think for me, I'm just very conscious that both Manchester, Greater Manchester, but also the Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority are already progressing down the franchise route, or have already done it under the kind of current set, the previous set of kind of devolved powers, and we are now obviously facing a completely new set of devolved powers. So I'm just interested to know how long it took you to deliver this and how you managed it, because I'm just very conscious that a lot of what's going to happen for future franchising is in the mix of devolution, mayors, growing unitary authorities, planning changes, education changes. So obviously you sound like you're achieving some really great things, but Martin just kind of added that little query of what about people's certainty jobs. I'm just interested to know how long your model took and what we might be expecting, and therefore if there might be an extension based on the current kind of local government changes.
Shall I go first with our experience? So I think the first decision to explore franchising was in 2019, but then obviously COVID intervened and it was really driven forward with the new mayor in 2021 when the assessment was developed to set out the kind of 5 cases of looking at the kind of strategic fit, what was going to best deliver for our bus strategy, and then obviously all the details of the financial, the economic impact, as well as the management and commercial cases. So that work was completed in May 2024, so it was a large piece of work, and the final assessment runs to 380 pages of quite technical modelling work, which had to be explored in detail to make sure that the 30-year business case was properly considered. After that, it then went through an audit process. That was then completed. We were working alongside the auditors for the latter part of the development to make sure that the business case was robust in their eyes. But they then complete an independent audit, which was completed in July. Decision to consult was taken by our board in the middle of July last year. We did the consultation, and as I said, in February we went through the governance process of all of the reports on the consultation, so all of our members could see all of the considerations. And then the decision was made. So the decision was made in February 2025, and we're looking to have the first franchises operating in autumn 2027. Obviously, we did have to outsource. The assessment was undertaken for us by consultants, and as well the audit has to be done in that way as well. And I think there are some issues in terms of capacity within local authorities to lead this work, which you've highlighted.
Okay, thanks. And before we move on, I've just got one other additional question, because the last session in this inquiry, we had some really good, great evidence around demand responsive transport and how that has capacity to improve connectivity in rural areas. And Judith, you touched on DRT. So do you foresee, or do you have DRT working in your regions, particularly Stephen and Judith?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our DRT is twofold. It is a ring and ride accessible transport service, which is at scale, as you would imagine in areas such as Greater Manchester, and it's a much smaller, we call it local link service, that particularly serves some rural areas, and we do have some rural and semi-rural areas such as Saddleworth up near the M62 and the Pennines. But it's perhaps reduced in scale compared to some rural areas. It isn't currently part of the B network, and it isn't franchised. It's run by operators, but it's, for example, under a more traditional grant arrangement. So inevitably we're looking at how now that would form part of our B network. It may well be at some point, in part or full, a franchised operation. We may well depot share, for example, for some of that as well. I think what's important to say for today is we are starting anyway now. We're underway with 2 so-called network reviews. So that's in Wigan and Bolton, the first areas to be franchised, and we're looking at a connectivity assessment there for the whole of Greater Manchester. So particularly before we do things like improve frequencies on existing routes, what about those areas that are not served, and what role could demand responsive have within that to a greater extent than before it's had, but integrated within a B network. So that's something we are at the early stages of doing. I feel fairly sure that we will in some way embrace it as part of the B network. It was a step too far to try to do that up front. We are referring to it increasingly now in our terms as neighbourhood transport. So DRT is good industry jargon, of which we have lots. And neighbourhood transport, we're all now in Greater Manchester trying to use to think about that connectivity, that local level. And many mainstream bus services are now franchised into rural areas, but DRT has, we think, an increased role, but possibly always slightly different unless to a more rural area.
And Judith.
Thank you. So the rural services, obviously, although Cambridge and Peterborough are very urban areas, we are surrounded by very rural areas and some of the sparsest populations in England in Fenland. So we have quite a challenging and diverse area. And within the rural areas, although we have primarily commercial services in the cities and intra-city, particularly on the busways, what we do, the majority of rural services are now either part funded or wholly contracted by the combined authority. So in practice, that's the rural service that we have now. Now, we still don't have the passenger numbers in some areas to sustain fixed bus routes, and that's why we've been looking very seriously at demand-responsive travel. So in 2023, we launched a trial service, which was called the Ting, which had a combined app service where you could book the one of 4 vehicles to take you from a village, maybe in West Huntingdonshire, into either to connect with another transport system, for instance, into a railway station or into a town or another village. And that ran extensively across West Huntingdonshire. On the review of that, we have now rolled out what we're calling Tiger on Demand, which covers 4 areas in West Huntingdonshire, Fenland, East Cambridgeshire and South Cambridgeshire. So they're 4 distinct areas. We've got one app provider. So we have the technology which we are centrally running, which then allows us to add additional vehicles or additional locations. And basically there's designated points. It doesn't pick you up from home, but it does pick you up from designated points in the village, but people can often request an additional stop, and we've done that, for instance, for National Trust visiting to enable that sort of thing to happen. So it is a flexible service. It only started fully operating on the 11th of January. But take-up is good, and we're able to monitor the journeys that are being taken and learn from that, and particularly learn from the communications, because it is a different mode of transport and people aren't necessarily used to it. So kind of thinking about how we communicate and get those messages out is really important as well.
Okay, sorry, Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just one point on DRT, and totally agree with what colleagues have said. We've run some commercial DRT and also DRT on behalf of local authorities. I think one point to make is there's a temptation to think it's a panacea for all rural transport issues, which it isn't. I mean, certainly as Judith mentioned, there are some examples, and Stephen said where it can work really well. But the operating costs of DRT are around 95% of a conventional bus service, because although the cost of the vehicle is cheap because it's basically a minibus, but you've got to pay for the software, and the software is pretty expensive. So you're not going to save much money, and you've got to pay the driver the same amount of money, which is absolutely right to do that. And then if you've got a deeply rural area, it's difficult to consolidate trips, and then you just end up being a taxi service, but a more expensive taxi service. So the point is DRT is good in some circumstances, but it's definitely not the panacea for solving all rural public transport issues. And I know Stephen wasn't talking necessarily about rural, but just a point to make.
That's useful to know. Okay, I think we need to move on. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. To Mr. Rhodes, Manchester is the only area in England outside of London to have implemented franchising. How is it working in practice? Appreciate you've touched a bit of that on your introductory remarks, but it'd be good to hear a bit more.
Thank you. I think I have to start from the perspective of a key part of my role now as the accountable lead from a sort of a TFGM perspective about performance, by which I mean punctuality, patronage particularly there. And that is now a daily sort of laser-like focus. I wanted the opportunity to say, so I'll do it now. I've worked in the rail and bus sectors for 35 years now, and there's never been a period whereby that level of accountability and focus on day-to-day operation in any regulatory environment has been quite as it is. It's very intense. It's very much looking at, I've been looking, for example, at yesterday's performance right across the Greater Manchester system. We are now, for the first tranche to be franchised, we are regularly performing now at above 80%. We have an 80% target. Of course, we want it to be higher. That has come through putting in additional resource to get the performance of the network that we inherited, which frankly wasn't good enough in terms of what we all want and expect buses to turn up on time. There's a number of reasons why problems occur, including obviously traffic and congestion, but we've done a lot there, particularly in that first tranche where it's now performing much better. In the areas that followed it, we call them tranches 2 and 3. So tranche 2 was a year ago, last weekend, and the last one was the one that started in the snow and ice in January. We're about at 70% since early February. So it was about stabilising what we've inherited. So before, in a sense, we get too carried away with these network reviews I've talked about and changing the network and doing things better, it's about making that perform. Surprise, surprise, of course, then if the network starts to perform better, people use it, more people use it. So in that first tranche area, Bolton, Wigan, parts of Salford that I've mentioned that went first, we've got their patronage growth of, and I have to use a round number for the purposes of all of those services, about 13% up. And more generally across the whole of Greater Manchester it's around 4-5%. So we have very stretching targets there. We have a 30% growth target in our bus strategy by 2030, so we know that we need to do a lot more, but that sort of bedrock is that the network performs and that people will then use it, particularly with this ongoing simplification. And just a quick name check again about the tap and go ticketing system that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So that just makes it very easy for people. It reduces barriers and speeds up boarding to be able to travel by tram and bus. So yeah, we've intervened and have in about 70 routes so far. They've all been quite minor changes. We've only put one totally new route on as yet. But as you would imagine, there are lots of requests to do things and do things differently. If something's not right and plainly isn't working properly, we've intervened and we continue to do so. That won't end, I don't think. We'll keep doing it. But then beyond that sort of stabilisation with this sort of relentless focus on service delivery, we are then starting to think in a more structured way about how we review areas, how we do, for example, more orbital services, because many bus services come in and out of Manchester effectively. Well, if you're in Rochdale, Oldham or Bury, for example, you want to be able to get around without coming into the centre. So we know there's a big appetite, probably is a good word, for that, but we need to do that in a slightly more careful, considered way. And we also want to improve frequencies. Many of those dropped in the run-up to and during COVID. So services you would expect in a big urban area, or perhaps also in London, to be running every 15 minutes, we want them to be 12 or 10. And we're starting to do some of that. But really, back to my earlier point, there's an awful lot more that we'll do. We are, I think, finally for now, also focusing a lot on customer information. We've got a B Network app which is proving very popular for ticket sales and vehicle tracking and so forth, and have a tremendous amount of investment in our bus fleet, electrification in particular, but not just electrification. We are doing some innovative stuff there about, for example, 2 wheelchair and buggy spaces on our new buses, which is proving quite popular. So I suppose I want to try and say there's a real positivity, there's a real can-do approach, including with franchise operators, because they are partners in this. It's not just about managing a contract. Obviously, there is a contract, but they are sort of medium-length contracts where we want and expect a sort of B-network partnership approach to continue to develop services over the length of the contracts. I'll probably stop there, I think. Could talk about that for much longer.
Just a very quick question. So you mentioned you've tweaked 70 routes over roughly how many routes in total do you have?
About 230, something of that
Okay,
sort.
so that's quite a high percentage.
But they've been sort of earlier or later services. We've also done a night bus. We are doing a night bus 24/7 trial, because other than in the south of Greater Manchester, where the commercial services that we've inherited had a night bus network, particularly a student network. So that's traditional in a sense of getting people in to the regional centre for the nighttime economy and for drinks and so on. But what we're trying to do in this first area, it's the go-ahead operation from Bolton, is trying to also do those sorts of things for people to access shift jobs, Royal Bolton Hospital, for example, which is going to require subsidy. It will take a while for that to actually gain traction. We've got to stick with it. One of the problems of the system and the network we inherited was it changed far too often. So we're making some of these changes thoughtfully, evolving, I suppose, the network that we've got without making radical changes. But we will continue, I'm sure, to make those changes over time. But we're really positive about where we've got to. And if you take that last tranche in the south of Greater Manchester that came on board on the 5th of January, well, that's only 2 or 3 months, and that's half of the entire network. So some of this is still quite new.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear your plans for night buses, because I certainly remember from my time living in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, it was remarkable how sparse the sort of night offer was for such a densely populated and large urban area. Something you've kind of hinted at this with your answer about orbital routes, but this applies to Greater Manchester as well. Often the big challenge is not just the focus on the large urban centres, but connecting them well to the smaller towns that are sort of around in the area. And do you feel that the franchising model gives you potentially more tools to improve that kind of connectivity?
Are you thinking particularly about cross-boundary into in our case, Derbyshire or Cheshire or so on?
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah, okay.
Potentially,
so,
yes.
So I think our workings with so-called service permits and cross-boundary operations are very much part of that initial stabilisation. So I think that's working well. It means that there's a safeguarding there of some of those services in terms of the vehicles that are used, the ability to pay for B network fares on some of those tickets. That's good. Some of them, those cross-boundary services, interestingly, there's a service to Huddersfield, which you'll know is in West Yorkshire, which is a B network service. So there are some services that are cross-boundary that are part of the B network. There are others, for example, from Burnley that are not. That, I think, gets us back to, well, this is what we've inherited, and working then with operators, including non-franchise operators, Transdev, for example, from Burnley, to look at how we can improve that over time. But we've really not lost services in any meaningful way from that. The network continues to evolve. But we were very mindful of not losing really important connectivity, which isn't just for those surrounding areas, but in some cases provides really important links within Greater Manchester as well on main corridors.
If I may just add to Stephen's answer, because we very much agree that there is a fantastic transformation of bus services happening in Greater Manchester at the moment. But I wouldn't want the committee to have the impression that in some way it's an automatic result of franchising. There's a recipe there, and there's a recipe that lots of other local authorities are following under different regulatory models. So a focus on punctuality and bus performance, listening to changing customer demands, putting on additional services, particularly in the evenings and weekends, investing in new buses. It's happening in lots of places and in areas as diverse as Portsmouth, one of the densest places in the country, and Norfolk, one of the least dense. You are seeing passenger numbers go up by 15, 16, 17% over the last year. So there are lots of places who are able to do similar things to Greater Manchester, but under the existing enhanced partnership framework.
Okay, thank you. Baggy.
Hi, morning. So, does the franchising model equip local authorities with the tools required to understanding journey patterns and, if necessary, tweak them, as you said?
Okay. I think in our case we've built capacity and capability over a long period of time. And I suppose as one of the largest metropolitan areas, we started as a PTE with a lot of that expertise, but we've needed to add to that and to look at, for example, commercial skills in the organisation. We've worked closely with and do continue to work closely with the DFT in that respect as well. So I think we've had to think about how we want and need to evolve the organisation particularly, and indeed what skill sets should exist within operators. So just thinking about your question there, I don't think that sort of has happened automatically, and continues to be part of that evolution.
Specifically about the journey patterns, do you get that information?
So, okay, sorry. So transformational really in terms of the amount of data we've now got access to. I mean, data isn't of course obviously in itself management information, so things and travel patterns that were to some extent commercially confidential, and I understand that previously, is now data that we have access to. Lots and lots of data about not just train running, even bus running, till I was a railwayman, but also about revenue and about travel patterns. And part of what we're looking at the minute, and with these network reviews I've talked about, is although a lot of that is about engagement and consultation with local people, quite rightly so, it's their B network, but we can bring data and insight to that once I think it's fair to say things have bedded down and we've actually understood more about the network and its characteristics than we ever had before.
I think you raise a really important question about the evidence base that we have, and going on the journey. Obviously we're not yet in the position that Greater Manchester are describing of having all of that data, but what we have done is very carefully prepared a business case that sets out the case, but that's based on quite limited data, because as you'll appreciate, if you much data is commercially sensitive. We do have data from those services that we contract, but we can't force commercial operators to share some of their data. And a lot of data that's held is not necessarily verifiable. So when we were going through our assessment process, and in particular the audit, we were asked by the auditors to rely on sort of national data, because the local data wasn't considered, there wasn't enough of it to be able to build the case on. So I do think there's some really important to appreciate that actually to reach the point where you can have a business case that's sufficiently robust to pass an audit, getting that data in place is really significant, but actually very challenging. And perhaps thinking about how that could be enabled by more detailed sort of collection of data, and making sure that local authorities have the ability, have the resource to be able to collect that data to ensure that there's a very firm evidence base to any decisions that they're taking to move to franchising from an enhanced partnership, or indeed change their enhanced partnership model.
I assume that national data is quite generic. It's not going to be specific for your area, is it?
Scott, did you want to come in on data? And there's a particular sort of we have the post-COVID.
Yes, so just so I'm really interested in what you're saying, Stephen, about Manchester. And I think it touches on Graham's points as well, and I think somebody else started off by saying that we shouldn't see franchising as a panacea. So I'm just trying to get to the bottom, Stephen, is what has franchising enabled you to do in Manchester that you couldn't have done otherwise? You know, just to be clear on that. And also some of the data from Manchester, you know, where you've picked your benchmarks, etc., inevitably you're caught within what would have been hopefully post-COVID recovery anyway. So how much of the growth and improvements in services can you say that is due to what you've done via franchising, and how much is it that kind of rebound through the response to the aftermath of COVID? Are you able to get to the bottom of that? Or
in many areas, many people got used to using their car when they didn't before and are ever going to go back. So sort of, Stephen.
I think quite simply we wouldn't be able to progress an integrated, joined up, simple to use transport system. So if it would continue to be fragmented, so seeing it beyond just bus franchising, but that enabler, and I've mentioned about ticketing, but more generally,
it's a very recent change,
but it is. Yeah. But effectively, there's a number of things that now have come together whereby we're able to plan the network. We're able to look at the best use of the resource available, because in certain areas of Greater Manchester, the network we've inherited reflects a more, in a sense, competitive network. So are all of those links in quite the right place? Do we want to try to do something more about a different network? So that will come through that engagement and those network reviews. But being able to look and plan a network that meets people's needs, so a level of engagement there with local communities, it just wouldn't have happened before, or our interventions would have been limited to being able to tender certain services that were loss-making, which would have given, I think, suboptimum outcomes, and the public funding being diverted in a particular way rather than looking at it as filling gaps in a joined-up network. I think in terms of growth, I'm very aware that there's some very successful enhanced partnerships and long-established enhanced partnerships elsewhere in the country. I think it's interesting that where we've been doing this longest in that tranche 1 area is also where we've got performance increases that are higher than elsewhere at this stage, because we've been working at it longer, and that more people are then using it.
You can link that to those decisions you've made rather than some other.
Well, I think it's really difficult to be precise about that.
Yeah.
But and I think from the perspective of me and my team, we've really got to have that laser-like focus on performance, because there is definitely a link. I think it would be. I couldn't sit here and say that there would be zero growth if we hadn't have franchised, and that. Our franchising assessment, I've talked compared to Judith relatively little about that, but that took a very long-term view at how long it would take to turn around a really inherently declining fragmented bus network, particularly to the north of Greater Manchester. So, as I've said a few times, that this is still pretty short-term, and we've made a start. But to reach those really challenging targets, particularly 200 million journeys per annum by 2030, 30% growth, we're going to need to keep going at that. I think that ticketing... Even
that 30% growth target, you're benchmarking that against where you were coming out of COVID.
Yep.
Which 30% sounds great, but is that realistic?
Well, I think it's pretty stretching.
Okay.
What it does do, though, is lead to almost a state of mind, which is, well, what do we need to do? We're not sort of resting on our laurels by that, or just looking at the performance of the existing network. But, for example, I've mentioned about orbital services, and getting the frequencies up on our key radial routes out of centres. So I think the narrative and the sort of attitude and approach, and that's clearly in our organisation, Transport for Greater Manchester, but working with franchise operators as well. How do we ensure there's a virtuous circle effectively there, and how do we really keep focused on improvements and doing, I suppose, innovative things in a sense? I'm sure some of that would be there without franchising, but to a much lesser extent, and would probably in reality tail off. What we should be able to do through this is continue to drive improvements.
You're a great salesman for it. Thank you.
Okay, can I move on to Alex now?
Thank you. I mean, this is on a similar vein, so particularly to Stephen. Is the introduction of bus franchising in Greater Manchester helping attract new passengers? So not is it not, so are they unique new passengers as opposed to are more passenger journeys being made? And if so, who are they?
Okay, a really interesting question, and it absolutely has to do that. I think sometimes we can get a little bit obsessed just by looking at who uses the network currently, albeit any organisation needs to keep its current customers, so that's quite right that we look at the satisfaction of those people. So the connectivity assessments I'm talking about doing as part of our network reviews are quite granular, and they're looking at areas that are served, not served well, and what do we need to do to improve them, and that's a core part of our network reviews as we go forward. So we know there are some hard to reach communities. We can see that in many cases, not all, but in many cases the network has declined over time there, so we know that we need to intervene. Reducing barriers is things such as the PayGo app that I've mentioned, the PayGo system, so it's easier for people to do that, but we are also maintaining being able to use cash to use bus services as well. We're very mindful about that. So a start, I think, has been made there. We're continuing to do some survey work looking at not only existing users, but we're looking at also at a wider population of GM about what will attract people and enable people to use the network. And it's interesting there because that's, I think, is about simplicity. Sometimes I find it a little bit hurtful. People say all you're doing is painting the buses yellow. That is part of it, but I think hopefully from today you can hear we're doing a lot more than that. But it does need to be simple. It needs to be something where we remove those barriers, and that's a key part of the work that we're doing in the long run.
So is your growth in passenger numbers new people?
It's both. It's both. And I think I know I'm talking a lot and mentioning a lot today, but we do think that being able to tap and go around the tram and the bus system and use both of those together, because we've got a lot of people. I've been out at our interchanges on Sunday, for example, and there are people that only use the tram and only use the bus. Yeah. So being able to use both is really important.
And these new passengers,
yeah.
Any idea who they are? Are they commuters?
I think
or are they all over the place?
It's probably too soon to say in great detail, but we're doing research around that. And we realise and know that there are difficult, hard to reach groups that we need to get to there.
One of the things we, as an operator, would say to attract new passengers, we need more punctuality and reliability. So we need more bus priorities. Yep. Because if we can get buses running more reliably and more punctually, then we can certainly get we can get more mode switching. It's very important.
Judith,
one of the things that we're very proud of is the work on the Tiger Pass, because we have particularly, the Mayor has been particularly passionate about the importance of getting people onto buses from the first opportunity, enabling them to reach learning and first job opportunities, as well as using the bus for leisure. And so in May last year, we introduced the Tiger Pass, which is free to all under 25s, and it effectively buys, each ticket is just £1 based on having the Tiger Pass. And last week we had 44,000 Tiger card holders, and we passed 1 millionth passenger journeys. Now obviously you've got a lot of people going to college using those passes, and that's why it's so high. But we're monitoring that really closely, because we really believe that if we can get established patterns of behaviour of people using buses at that age, that can be really game changing for the future.
Okay, thank you. We are sort of running short of time, and we've still got quite a few important questions to ask, so brief answers, please. Rebecca, you've got a quite...
Well, actually, do you know what, Chair? I'm really sorry. I'm looking at 10. I think 8 is covered, so why don't
right, okay. I'll move on to Baggy then.
Okay, back to local authorities again. So, people like the Centre for Cities and others have said there's capacity issues and resource challenges for local authorities implementing bus franchising. How do you think they can be best overcome?
So from our point of view, I think probably the most important thing would be longer term funding settlements. As a combined authority, each combined authority has a different settlement, and the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough combined authority will be very different to Transport for Greater Manchester, both now and in the future. But I think longer term funding settlements then allows us to plan in the longer term. We have been able to supplement the funding that we have through the Mayor's decision to have a precept. So we had a £12 precept in 23-24, and we now have a £36 precept in 24-25 and 25-26, and all of that money, it generates about £7.5 million a year. All of that money is used for buses. So that has created us some capacity, but clearly there's only some combined authorities that have those powers. But I think that's really important to recognise. There isn't the staffing capacity in many unitary authorities and councils to be able to do these kind of work is a really important barrier for them to be able to progress this option.
So I think Judith's absolutely right to flag the importance of long-term funding settlements, which are fundamental in a number of areas. There are some other things the government could be doing now. For example, it funds a body called the Bus Centre of Excellence, which has got a really important role to play in training new staff coming into local authority departments and in sharing best practice across local authority and operator communities. So really important that government continues to promote that as well.
Okay. Miriam's just covered it.
James just answered your question. Right, okay, that's excellent. So, Katie.
Thank you, Chair. Just coming back to financial risks, several local authorities and councils have told us that they simply couldn't afford to take on the franchising model. The upfront costs are very high, and of course there's the ongoing financial risk if passenger numbers are lower than forecast. Could maybe those of you who've implemented the model give us a sense of what your setup costs were and how you manage that ongoing financial risk, how you're thinking about that?
So we say quite publicly that our setup costs are 134 point something million. I have forgotten the decimal place, but just to give you I think that's precise enough. And
that money came from?
That was funded largely locally. But clearly, I sort of echo Graham's comment. I don't think there's any difference at all around the need for continued ongoing funding. So then, beyond that, there is clearly funding that goes into the network, and there is a subsidy level. Few services are what you might call, in a standalone sense, profitable. But what we're trying to do there increasingly is not just look at it from a very simple cost per passenger and subsidy. I mean, that clearly is a relevant barometer, but if this is also about looking at opening up wider opportunities to economic growth, social inclusion, which it is, then one of the, and a good example of this actually is the night bus that I talked about, because it will always cost a lot of money to do a night bus operation, but actually then being able to assess what the benefits are from something such as that, and the social benefits that go beyond a traditional way of looking at that just in quite narrow public transport terms, is really important.
And then I don't know if Ms. Barker, you want to comment on that as well?
Yes, absolutely. So our setup costs are probably a couple of orders of magnitude smaller than Manchester's at the moment. And our focus has been, we've had a contract to prepare the assessment that I described that went through that process. We had a contract with the auditor. We had a contract to deliver the consultation. And all the staff costs as well, but we would be looking at, as I say, a couple of orders of magnitude lower than the Manchester figure at this stage. But clearly we're just commencing on implementation. We have an implementation budget, and we are following, we are just literally setting up 9 work streams to work through all of the work in order to get us to the autumn 2027 go live. But there is a really important piece about the business that we would be taking over is a £70 million a year business that we will be running the bus services of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So it is a huge step from where we are now to there, and resourcing that implementation journey is massively important, and learning from the experience of others is critical to that.
And was that similarly mostly locally funded?
Yes.
Yeah. And on that note, maybe just about resourcing, obviously the risks of franchising aren't just financial, they're also about capacity and capability to actually do the work of running the bus services. And I think Mr. Vidler, the Confederation of Passenger Transport, highlighted that risk in your evidence. What risks do you see in devolving funding to areas that don't have that capacity and capability?
So there is a very real risk, I think, of central government money being devolved to local authorities, which is right, which is a good thing to do, but it not delivering the outcomes that nationally we all want to see. We've given the Department for Transport some suggestions for the sort of indicators they might want to use to monitor local authority performance, not hand-holding what local authorities do, because local authorities know best, but making sure that the outcomes that matter most to passengers, so are the buses punctual, are there enough of them, do they go to the places people want to go to, fundamentally are passenger numbers increasing, making sure that those things are tracked and monitored consistently across the country so that central government can understand that they're getting value for money, delivered in different ways in different parts of the country, but value for money for the investment they're putting in. I think that's really important.
And are there any other indicators? Obviously, it's difficult to measure performance of something that doesn't already exist, but is there anything else that local authorities could use or that central government could use to assess track record to decide whether or not an area was appropriate for franchising?
I think it has to be a locally driven decision. I think what's really, really important is that local leaders are aware of the spectrum of options, so different degrees of enhanced partnership. There's many, many things you can do with an enhanced partnership, and different approaches to franchising, from a sort of micro-franchising approach where you perhaps franchise a particular route or corridor, through to the sort of full integration approach that Stephen and colleagues have taken in Greater Manchester. They've all got different transition costs, they've all got different risks, they've all got different costs and benefits. I think it's really important we consider them all.
Thank you. And I think just a last one. We've touched on rural areas in a few questions, and I just wanted to come back to that. I represent a rural patch of the Kentish countryside, and our written evidence was pretty consensual, I think, that franchising is broadly perhaps not appropriate for rural areas. So I came to the session today assuming it sort of wouldn't be the right fit for my area. But Judith, it sounds like you're a bit more positive about it, and I know that there are areas of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough that are very sparsely populated. I'd just be interested to hear a little bit more about why that is and whether anybody feels that there's anything about the viability of rural franchising that perhaps we haven't covered already.
Yes, and I actually, interestingly, through the consultation process, it was absolutely the case. You go to the meetings in different rural and urban settings, and you perhaps expect different voices. Yeah. Although there were many different voices telling us different things. But interestingly, I wouldn't say that there was a rural-urban split in terms of support for franchising. What people were seeing in rural areas was that lots of services had been cut, either completely or their frequency had been reduced, and they felt that they weren't getting a service that was focused on the public good, that their kids couldn't any longer get to school. They were making choices about schools based on where they could get to rather than which A-levels they wanted to do. And so they wanted a service that was going to fit the public good, and they weren't convinced that the current deregulated service was going to do that. So they were therefore looking at that model as an alternative that seemed to be focused around the public good. I mean, that clearly there's, as Stephen has described, there's going to be a kind of lift and shift, and franchising isn't the only option because it is money that ultimately pays for the increased services. I think the other key aspect is seeing that there are commercial services in Cambridge and Peterborough and between Cambridge and Peterborough, and there is an opportunity of the surpluses from those to be reinvested in rural areas to get better connectivity across the whole. So I think people were ambitious to see, instead of perhaps a more publicly focused service, whereby that money can be retained to be spent in rural areas to improve their service and their access to the cities as well.
Just one point I would make is that a lot of the services that have disappeared in rural areas since 2010 have been those that were sponsored by local authorities. So it wasn't the commercial network that has necessarily reduced. A lot of it has been local authority services. And I'm not saying that to make a point against local authorities. The point I would make is that rural franchising could work, but at the end of the day, it's all down to money.
Yeah,
And
so if you're subsidising anyway,
if you're that's right,
subsidise
and
or franchise is kind of potato.
Exactly, and,
right.
and obviously the greater risk in rural areas is that you've inevitably got less passengers, and therefore if you've got less passengers and you want a better level of service, those passengers are going to have to pay for that higher level of service, or it's going to have to come from the local taxpayer. So you've still got the same problem that you've had for a number of years, which is how do you subsidise the rural network? And when Judith was talking about cross-subsidy, there is a sort of an equity point there that I'm not saying it's not right, but it should be debated. Is it right for people in urban areas to cross-subsidise those people in rural areas? It's a debating point that should be talked about.
Politics money. Alex.
Judith, you said earlier that your MCA was already subsidising most rural services. Are they net or are they gross contracts?
I would need to get back to you on the details of the contracts, because we've got a range of different contract styles and there isn't one single answer to that, but I'd need to get back to you in writing with the details.
Can I ask then, Stephen, were yours previously net or gross?
Gross.
They were gross. So did that give the authority kind of some of the skills that you needed when you moved forward into franchising? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That's useful. Right, where are we? Steph.
Talking about rural delivery and my sort of rather simple, slightly bumpkinish view that people want to get buses to places they want to go at times they want to travel at.
Radical?
Which is possibly quite reductive and certainly radical. Do we need to sort of get over, in rural areas in particular, the idea of bringing buses to people's doors and actually look at the travel user making their own way to a place that might not be in the centre of every single village in order to catch a bus that fits the bill I've described? Does that make sense?
And I guess that's how demand responsive travel works with our kind of mobility hub concept. So if you were in a village in Fenland, for example, what we would and obviously it's still bedding down, but there might be 2 or 3 places in that village where you could access. You book the demand responsive travel, you would go to that point, you would get on it, it would say take you to the place with the nearest train station. And one of the things that we're very keen on and has been discussed in depth at our board meetings, so there's a lot of political support, is the integration of how bus franchising works with other forms of transport, because we absolutely recognise DRT is expensive, as has been said on the panel, and if it becomes effectively a taxi service, it isn't going to work very effectively. But what we need to do is to think, how can we get people to a point which works for the benefit of that market town or that large village, bringing more people into that place, but that then place becomes a place where the more fixed bus route runs, or there's a train station. And we're very optimistic from the increased powers and the work that the increased powers that combined authorities, strategic authorities are going to get, and the work that Great British Railways are doing, that we'll be able to have a much more integrated system with rail going forward from where we perhaps have now, and also working very closely with active travel to think about how all of that connects in. Clearly it isn't a solution for everybody, but the more people that we can get going into central hubs, mobility hubs in our market towns, we believe is going to be critical to helping as part of an overall solution. It isn't one solution, it's lots of things within the system that we need to tweak and work together.
So I would simply add that I think it's an essential approach, that approach of building hubs in market towns, for example, that people can get to, because the alternative is likely to be simply too expensive to do in one go. So the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England looked at this issue a few years ago. They were advocating for a bus every hour in every village, I think, and they costed that as requiring about £2.7 billion of subsidy a year. It's probably not credible to spend that sort of amount of money. So I think we have to look at ways in which we can get people to those transport hubs in market towns and onto the main bus network.
One thing I'll just caution everyone about with connections and everything is, if you look at our competition, which is the private vehicle, it's parked outside someone's house and then they drive to where they want to go immediately. And so if you ask people to make a connection at a drafty rail station where you've got to wait 10 minutes, you need to really think strongly about about that integration and how it works. It can work in some cases, but we do need to think about the competition, and certainly in the sort of the commercial sector, the services that work the best are the ones that are direct and fast and quick and go down the radial corridors to get people where they want to be.
I need to be able to drive to these hubs in that case.
Possibly, I mean, park and ride is a popular concept. All I'm saying is that you just need to think about, if we're looking at public transport and buses playing a much wider role than a sort of a last resort form of transport, you need to think about the competition. The competition is the private vehicle. Get into your car outside the house and you go exactly where you want to go.
I agree.
Yeah, as I intimated before, a lot of people switched back to cars or to cars over COVID, and bringing them back to public transport for at least some, if not all, their journeys is presumably the challenge. One last question, Catherine.
Stephen, you briefly talked about cross-boundary measures, but what are the risks to neighbouring authorities if one area franchises but the others don't?
I think so far our work suggests that they can be mitigated by working together. I think there's a safeguarding actually that can happen through looking at those services properly up front and deciding whether they would form part of a franchise or whether they're not, and they're cross-boundary and they run in through a service permit. Our dialogue with surrounding authorities, which is other combined authorities and shires and a unitary authority, suggests that those issues can be worked through. So I probably wouldn't want to add any more to that. I don't know, Judith, whether you did.
I mean, we're obviously at a slightly earlier stage, but we're developing a service permit consultation with all of the surrounding authorities, and indeed they were invited and participated in the consultation process in the autumn. We also work with Transport East and East of England's economic heartland as well, to make sure that we're developing those relationships across the wider area, because it's very clear that, you know, many residents, for instance, on the west might gravitate more to Bedford, and their interest, for instance, will be in how the services work there. So certainly from the public point of view, that's really important. But we believe that the work that we're doing in engaging with those service providers is really important. It's also important to think about there's also private operators who are outside it. For instance, Cambridge University are bringing people into Cambridge. There's science parks that are moving people around as well, and making sure that we're also engaging with these other operators as well as home to school transport. Because one of the things we're very clear about is some of the operators that are doing these routes are actually delivering home to school transport. And if that were affected in any way by franchising, that could be very difficult for home to school transport and indeed that business. So we need to be very actively managing and understanding the consequences that there could be of a negative impact. So we're working very hard to make sure that we're considering that up front to make sure that doesn't happen.
Just one quick question. I think there is a risk, because people's travel patterns don't respect administrative boundaries. But one thing that the government could really do to help is the way the service permit guidelines, or the legislation that's being developed at the moment that Stephen mentioned. It's about obligations of operators coming into franchised areas. I think it should be changed to rights. So it's rights rather than obligations. So operators that are coming from outside a franchised area into a franchised area should have the right to join a ticketing scheme, should have the right to have access to a bus station, and should have the right to have their publicity as part of the overall publicity for a franchised area, and that would really help to smooth that process.
If I could
Thank
just
you,
come...
that's very useful.
Sorry, I was just going to add one thing. I think it's very real now, the differences. So, for instance, on our Tiger card, you can get on a bus in Cambridge and go to Newmarket and use it, but then when you're in Newmarket, you can't come back because you're in Suffolk. So you have to pay a full fare. So we are seeing these issues, and bus drivers and bus companies are experiencing these issues. So it's happening now, and we have to think really, really carefully, because as you've just said, it isn't how people live their lives. And we need to think about how we have simple systems that people can use and operate to do their daily lives without those kind of barriers in the way.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for reminding us, of course, why we're doing this. It's about people and how they travel and how they should be able to travel easily and hopefully cheaply as well. Thank you very much for your evidence, and if there's anything that came up at the session or otherwise that you would like to additionally send to us, please do. This brings the first panel to the end, and so thank you, as I say, for your time and for your preparation. I'm going to suspend the session for a few minutes while our next witnesses take their place at the table. The sitting is suspended. Order. I'd like to welcome everyone to our second panel, and could I ask you to introduce yourselves?
Hello, I'm Damien Jones. I'm representing the LGA, but I'm Deputy Director for Transport, Environment and Waste at Devon County Council. I'm also National Chair for the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers.
Hi, I'm Alistair Hands. I'm the Managing Director for UK Bus Regions at Arriva.
Hello, I'm Naomi Green, Managing Director of England's Economic Heartland, Southern National Transport Body.
Good morning, I'm Miriam Binsztok. I'm the Transport Coordination Service Manager for Cornwall Council, and I'm here representing Cornwall Council and our Transport for Cornwall partnership.
Excellent, thank you. So, could I ask each of you to respond to my question, which is, what are the main advantages of the enhanced partnership model as a framework for improving local bus services? Let's start with Damien.
So the enhanced partnerships, I'm talking from Devon's experience and also from other local authorities I represent, is that it's brought colleagues closer together, so it's formed better operating relationships with local bus companies. Within councils, it's meant we've got a better working relationship, particularly with highways, in terms of how we are managing the network to impact on buses and how we can make improvements. It can be a little bit of a struggle with utility works that take place, but it's actually improved the relationship and how we respond to day-to-day events on the network. It's also meant that we've got good feedback from various partners into the partnership, so we've got different groups represented. We've got people that are accessing education, healthcare, all those kinds of bodies that are included in it as well, so it's been a really good, positive experience.
From my perspective, I think the requirement for the bus service improvement plan, in as much as the enhanced partnerships is a formal arrangement to bring together operators and the local authority, but at the centre of that, having a considered plan around the outcomes for the travelling public that sits at the heart of it, I think is really, really important, because then bringing together the things that the local authority can do in terms of transport bus prioritisation, but also then what operators can bring to that in terms of commercial operation and innovation. I think bringing those together, but starting fundamentally with that bus service improvement plan, I think is really important.
Amy?
It's the most light touch way of moving forward with a pathway for gradual improvements. From a revenue risk perspective for the local authorities, it keeps the revenue risk with the operators, but actually has a shared reputational risk. Where we've seen where enhanced partnerships are most effective is where they've got really strong local political leadership, and I'm sure it will come on to the fact that the most effective ones are where there's more funding.
Yeah, so similar to what others said today here, the enhanced partnership is really that framework, that document that we can all come together and really articulate, share vision, share objectives and what we want to achieve for transport, especially transport in Cornwall. So for us, our journey towards partnership started 2015-16 when we started with the idea of our one public transport for Cornwall. And shortly afterwards, we had a mass retender of our network where we have our colleagues from Go Cornwall Bus. So from 2020 onwards, we were able to really start that idea of working in partnership, creating and articulating to the public what we wanted for that brand of transport for Cornwall. So we were in a really good position to bring others to the table, and I think that's one of the greatest benefits of the enhanced partnership.
And other limitations with the enhanced partnership model that make it less effective than the franchising model in delivering improvement in buses?
So from a local authority point of view, I think we can say that what lacks on the enhanced partnership is that operational accountability. So it's not a legal enforceable document. So one of the great things we do in Cornwall is the integration of our network. Jem and her team do an absolutely cracking job trying to integrate the whole network change. And then we have fares, we have roadside information, etc. And getting all the parties aligned in that project plan is really important. So when we have like one activity slipping here or something slipping there or a deadline that is not met, it compromises the whole critical path. And I think from an operational point of view, not having that ability to enforce key operational agreements, key operational commitments, make the enhanced partnership a goodwill document, but also from an operator point of view, and Alistair, you can correct me, I would feel that it's really good for them to actually articulate to the groups, to the shareholders, to the executive boards. This is a commitment that I made at a local level. This is something that is linked to actually funding or being enforceable. So actually give everyone that clarity about expectation, but levers to make things happen.
Okay, anybody want to add anything to that?
My perspective, I think they're only as good as their constituent part, so it needs a good quality plan and it needs really true collaboration between the local authority and the operators. Touching on the point around operational performance, I think it's in everybody's interest to deliver strong operational delivery on the ground, because that's what ultimately generates patronage, so I think that works. And the other piece would be, I guess it doesn't give the local authority direct control over price and route, but it does come with it the attraction of being relatively quick, relatively low investment, and you get to the delivery of benefits sooner.
Okay. Can I just add a couple of points to that? So in the EEH region, we have 104 bus operators operating across the 12 authorities that are in our partnership. And bus operators don't have to join EPs, which means that where the committee were probing earlier on the major operators, it's often really hard to get the small operators to commit the time to kind of shape and influence what those EPs might need to look like. The other thing is based on that is the amount of time it takes to build those really strong relationships. That's the same with franchising, but it's probably easier to dip in and out of an EP unless you've got that strong political leadership, and I think that's a big risk for them. And when it comes to capacity and capability in the local authorities, it is much harder to kind of keep these going unless you've got that strong commitment to do so.
Thank you.
I think it's also down to strong relationships as well, so that's quite key. And if you look at the commercial network, if you take into account the money that the council might be putting in for local school children, if you look at the national bus pass that's funding going in, even on a commercial network, there's quite a lot of money that the councils are putting into that to be able to influence how it operates.
Thank you very much, Chair. we've heard in a few sessions now over the weeks about the challenges of planning effectively in the current funding timeframe context. How does the lack of a multi-year funding stream affect the ability of enhanced partnerships to deliver long-term improvements?
I think from a local from a local authority perspective, and I would feel like from a whole partnership, you need to have the certainty of return on investment and being able to plan ahead. And the environment at the moment is quite financially risky because we have so many uncertainties. So I think the long-term funding gives everyone their ability to be secure on what we're going to be investing, what is the potential return, and also plan in advance in the long term. However, it has to be acknowledged that for rural local authorities, the funding is going to have a different benefit ratio. So we in Cornwall already subsidize over 50% of the network, which means that there is a strong commitment from the Council in public transport through our 8-year contract with Go Cornwall Bus. And even though we had that long-term commitment and long-term line on the budget, it's still very challenging. And something that I'm going to kick myself if I don't mention is one of the reports that we had from our colleagues on CPT. And they did a great report around the return on investment on the local bus services. And they say that for every £1 that is invested in local bus service, the return is £4.55. And I think it's just changing that mentality when you're talking about long-term funding. For us here, public officers, we are actually investing into the public bus. We're going to be reducing the bill in social care. We're going to be maximizing ability for people to have social mobility, access education, employment, but also the industry as a whole generates a lot of money. So I think framing that long-term settlements as long-term investment gives everyone a bit more levers and ability to really use that money for the best.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you.
How successful do you think that enhanced partnerships have been in improving bus services outside of major urban centres? So we're not necessarily talking about the very rural, we're also talking about your average market town.
Go on, Naomi.
Yeah. I think it's hugely varied. So some of the locations within the EEH region, Hertfordshire, for example, who've had a long commitment to an enhanced partnership that became an enhanced partnership, are currently seeing 95% reliability rates, 18% year-on-year growth, but they are rarities rather than the norm. Actually, where an enhanced partnership in the EEH region is particularly successful is where you've either got really good infrastructure, like the Luton to Dunstable guided busway, where 20% of all trips between those two places are by bus. That is unbelievably high, and 10% year-on-year growth in patronage on the busway. But that has a specific reason. It's reliable and it's actually quicker than the car. It's those conditions that make them successful. And just coming back to your the previous question about long-term funding, it's being able to plan a reliable network and being responsive to where there are those needs for improved reliability that can only be achieved if you have funding over a longer period of time.
Okay, I'm just going to slot in a question that I asked the previous panel about demand responsive transport. What's your relationship with DRT, the opportunities and the challenges, Damien?
I think particularly because we cover in a large rural area, as many councils do, DRT in its sense that a lot of it's being developed, it's required a significant amount of funding. So in Devon in particular, we've tried a different model based around taxis. So we've got a fare car scheme where if we've got buses that have got very low numbers, we can use those to take people to points where they can get on other transport, or we can take them to their destination. So it's just that model of DRT that is available in a lot of areas now does require significant funding. So we're trying a sort of a different way of doing it in Devon.
We've operated significant DRT services. I'd echo the point that I think on a standalone commercial basis it's really challenging. But But if you look at it at the wider place-based economics that we talked about earlier, that I think it can be a way of delivering service for a lower cost per kilometre over a wider area. But it is important to be able to join up demand streams from kind of commercial customers to education to help, non-emergency patient transport in order to make it really work.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just, the other thing that is looking at that total transport concept in rural areas, so that you're managing the network for the passenger, so we manage the non-emergency patient transport alongside the schools, alongside the public, so you get that integration of journeys, because there's lots of journeys that take place that isn't necessarily planned together, so it's trying to bring that together as well to get the best access in rural areas.
We're just on both. So we're, as an STB, have been asked by our authorities to look at exactly that total transport. It's a huge pressure on local authorities, as you will well know, and actually how we can look at transport its entirety, both in terms of home to school transport, but public transport is a really big opportunity that we think data and innovation can do a huge amount to move it forward. Just coming back to DRT, there are examples like Milton Keynes where actually DRT can bring down the cost of services, subsidised services, and they are proving really effective. We've also done some really important work around mobility hubs that I know you were talking about earlier, and the role of DRT in servicing high-frequency corridors and whether you can break it up that way.
Okay, thank you. Right, Scott.
Thank you, Chair. In the last session we heard a little bit about transport integration, and of course whenever you get transport people together they talk about integration. But talk is cheap, isn't it? So do enhanced partnerships actually make integration easier between travel modes?
I think they can. I think there's a great example within our network in Leighton Buzzard where we have, in conjunction with Bedford Council, invested in new vehicles. We essentially looked and collaborated with them around the tendered network to reshape it, to integrate the timetable with local rail services. So yeah, I think they absolutely can in the right places.
And I think as well, like on a lot of enhanced partnerships, we've got rail operators that are part of that. So in the southwest, Great Western sit on the enhanced partnership, so you can look at how you can integrate between the modes with bus links that connect with the trains and then go into the rural areas as well.
So rail and buses is good, but what about active travel links in terms of your particularly cycle networks? Is that something?
Yeah, so with regards to integration in Cornwall, we are doing a really good job, not only integrated the whole network, but also with our collateral interventions, such as our interoperability. So we have like our any ticket, any bus, so you can buy any ticket in Cornwall and use in any of our bus, as the name says. We have standardization of fares as well. So this, when we talk about integration, there's a whole piece about not only your transport mode, but actually how we can make it really easy, similar to what we have here in London. We have really good relationship with our colleagues from GWR in rail, and we are trying as much as we can to integrate modes. Something that it's enabler but a challenge in Cornwall. We talking about home to school, and I think it was brought in the previous session. We integrate a lot of our schools' movements in our public transport network because it's better for the student, but it's also better for our budget. And that creates a bit of limitations about how flexible we can be with our network when we're trying to align with that hard rail timetables. With active travel, following the restructuring, the council, the transport strategy team sits in the same team as public transport, so we all are headed by the really amazing director, service director, and head of service. So we are able to have like more integration. We have our burial bikes in Cornwall that are really been a success. So we are trying to make sure that there are places when people need, and people can actually do, as you say, you can go from your bus station to town, get your burial bike a bit further. So that's working really well. And hopefully with the integrated transport strategy that the DFT is launching, is going to give us further opportunities to bring this to a further level.
Further opportunities and further money, hopefully, for you. So all this sounds like common sense, of course. So what is it about enhanced partnerships that makes these things more likely?
I I think it's helped having, like I mentioned earlier, particularly like with highways colleagues, it's brought the bus companies closer to those relationships. Yeah. And you know, within the local authority, we obviously talk about things, but it's given access, I think, to more opportunities to have those kinds of conversations about, we're thinking about doing this to the network, what impact does it have on the bus?
And I think the recovery from the pandemic has been an incentive to do that. It's brought operators and local authority together with a challenge and a purpose in mind, and how do you maintain a healthy network to join customers together. So I think the enhanced partnerships, if you take the example of Leicester, have been really positive in doing that, because the local authorities are able to bring to the party bus priority measures. I think there are 8 that we put in place that make the network itself more effective. To your point, it makes journey times lower, it connects people into where they need to be quicker, and we've got common payment systems, so a London-style payment system there. So it's that kind of synergy between there's a need, and you bring together the parties who have access to the funding or the operations, and you can put it together and blend supported and purely commercial services. So I think it's that connection that makes it important. But I also think when you consider the models, it's important not just to think about place, but time. So we've talked about a lot about the risk of transition to franchising, perhaps. So there are places, I think, where enhanced partnerships can be the right thing in a place at a point in time in order to stabilise services, get the network as performant as it needs to be, and then consider what model of control is appropriate.
Yeah, and that investment isn't a wasted investment, and certainly in the term. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Steph.
Yeah, just building on integration, I know I'm going to get sort of lynched by the eco mob for saying this, but one mode of transport that's still quite popular in rural areas is the motor car. You may have heard my previous question to the previous panel about whether we need to rethink the model of rural public transport a bit. Does enhanced partnership working allow for that kind of radical rethinking of what the rural transport model could look like?
In terms of service provision or accepting that you might have to do a bit of your trip by car to connect to a point?
Very much the latter.
Okay. So I think it's absolutely part of the solution. And if you look at what you were hearing from Mrs. Barker from the Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority perspective, where they have got a guided busway, and if you look at the number of people that drive to the busway to then travel into Cambridge, it's huge and a really huge opportunity. The issue with that is there are lots of people who can't afford a car. It's a big barrier to young people, and actually by not building public transport into those solutions, you're actually just exacerbating the barrier. I'm going to, if I may, just give one example. I went to Silverstone to a company recently, an incredible advanced manufacturing company, where they bring graduates, lots of graduates to come, and they feel real privileged to work there. They live in the neighbouring village. They don't drive. They cannot access a gym in the evening. They cannot access any social facilities. We are at risk of losing people like that because those facilities aren't there. All they need is some public transport to make it an attractive long-term option for them.
So on the question of the enhanced partnerships and how much you could do that, no, that's okay. Great, I'll build on your example if I may. So one argument would be that franchising, for instance, would allow the revenue from that popular route to be used to subsidise a much more dedicated either DRT or small local electric minibus service for exactly that exact reason. Does the enhanced partnership model allow that kind of flexibility? Could we be exploring any of these things within the current EP approach?
I think the enhanced partnership model will allow better conversations about it. It's no doubt that I believe that one of the big drivers for the Cambridge and Peterborough model was exactly the question you said. How do we use the benefit of those high-frequency routes to support the less affordable routes? The enhanced partnership model is never going to do it in the same way, but the cost of implementing them in a more rural area is a big barrier for local authorities. One of the things that we are looking at the moment is whether we could create a capacity tool to help individual authorities analyse whether or not franchising is a good route for them. Mm-hmm. That's not available at the moment, and so they don't have a way of going from where they are to a franchising model.
I think you've got to separate out the two thought processes. How you fund rural connectivity, I think, is a separate question from the model of operation. Absolutely. Can enhanced partnerships do what you're talking about? Absolutely they can, because you can manage the network, you can coordinate frequencies, and the local authorities can support with shared facilities that all operators can use. So it can absolutely bring people together to achieve that type of effect. But I think the concept that you would fund it purely out of high density routes is probably unlikely nationally.
Yeah, I think I echo that. I think we are focusing so much on the framework, and the enhanced partnership is a framework. It's something that allows parties to come to the table, have conversations, but as everyone says here, any model could work if we have enough funding. And sometimes it's a whole idea that we can cross-subsidize something here, use some commercial, commercial profit to subsidize the less profitable services. Depending on the size of your area and how your network is designed, it becomes very, very difficult. So I think it's just like any model, any framework can work, and I think if we have like enough money in the table to actually make those things work.
I think in a lot of areas, we haven't got those high-frequency services that are generating a lot of profit. There's a lot of commercial withdrawal since COVID, and particularly park and ride services have had the least amount of recovery in the terms of the number of passengers, so they're not necessarily those dedicated services anymore. They're part of the network, so we need to rethink how we can repurpose park and ride and make it a more attractive option again by looking at different models for different areas.
Hey, thanks, Steph. You done?
Yes, I think am I next?
I think you've just... Hang on, where are we? 21?
20.
Sorry.
If you want to do 20.
Yeah, Scott.
Sorry.
Oh, we've done 20.
You've done it? Yeah.
We've done 20. We've done
I think
yours.
I've done mine.
Yeah. Do you want to, anything else you want to add?
You can keep talking if you want.
I was going to ask Miriam specifically. I mean,
the supplementary in particular.
About the transformational improvements that you've seen in Cornwall. I mean, we perhaps prior to that last discussion, we've heard about EPs being the lightest touch way of bringing parties to the table. Certainly, some of the testimonies from Damien and Alistair make me think, that's. I wasn't aware of the sort of conflict of resources that perhaps goes with hospital transport and school transport, but that sort of stuff makes sense, sort of common sense stuff, which banging heads together, that makes sense. Can you tell us more about the transformational effects that you've seen and what in particular have been the key aspects of them, please?
Yeah, so as I said, I think Cornwall has had a commitment to working in partnership way before my time, and something that is 10 years back, where we brought everyone to the table to talk about the one public transport for Cornwall. And as I said before, with the contract and with the enhanced partnership, we were able to really bring everyone to the table and have these conversations. I have to be really honest, we have been very fortunate to get a lot of funding from the DFT that allowed us to undertake some key initiatives, such as our bus fare pilot. So it's a 4E program where we lower the fares really, really low, and to test the assumption would low fares bring more people to the buses. And that was very critical to allow us to work with the operators and create interoperability, standardization of fares, deliver discounts. So we just launched our young person discounts and our Transport for Cornwall app, where we have that in our, cannot forget my bus timetable here, where we have like all the bus times and we have all the operators together. And that is very, very, it's something that we have to be extremely proud, and has been, as you say, very transformational to have that level of integration. The way that Cornwall network works, we have 50% subsidized by the council, the other 50% is run commercially. So I think, as I said before, as a framework, the enhanced partnership really allowed all of us to have that setting where we can have these conversations, that we can discuss with operators what do we want to achieve, set out the vision, making sure that we have key performance indicators, not enforceable, but they are there to set up the direction. And I think that has been really very fortunate for Cornwall. With our BSIP, we were able to actually work with operators as well, not only on the capital improvements and capital interventions to improve the overall journey for the passenger, but also to look at how we, with the revenue portion of the BSIP, how we could continue to stabilize the network. And that's something that has been like a very key direction from all of us. The team always says that our network is a bit of a rubber band, like our funding. We can only stretch so far. And even with the levels of commitments and the level of investment, the commitment of Cornwall Council to actually fund public transport, we are still seeing some reductions of service. We are still having to look at how we can see the resources better allocated. But there are still really things that we have to celebrate. The results of the Your Bus Journey survey, they came out yesterday. We were 1 point higher than last year. Overall satisfaction continued to be good. And that is a journey that we continue. So it's never like a end point, isn't it? It's a journey. And I think as we evolve the partnership, we're going to be continuing to look at what next and what else we can do.
Is there one measure in particular that you're particularly proud of from yesterday's results?
If I have the overall satisfaction, I think the fact that we are really good, but also something that we are always really good is like the bus drivers. And I think that's something that we all can be really proud, the fact that the bus drivers are that first impression, isn't it? When you get in the bus, they are the one representing. And that's something that I'm extremely proud. And also, we are just about to deliver a Transport for Cornwall training for the drivers, because we really want all of them to feel part of the partnership, regardless which operator is your employer.
Can you tell us what the number was for very good satisfaction overall?
84%, 85.
Okay.
No, come on, you're going to have 86.
Don't worry, it's in the 8. Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. Scott, did you want to ask a question on this topic?
Yes. Before I ask my question, the point about bus drivers is an absolute key one, because what I see in Edinburgh and Cornwall will be the same. There's tourists come from all over the world, and very often you hear them asking for bus drivers for directions, and you know where things are and how the city works, and the drivers do a fantastic job in helping with that. So you said in terms of your network, half your service, half your routes are run at profit by private companies, another half you subsidise. But if you were to franchise that, surely you could bring them all together, and there'd be a chance that those profitable routes would help you with a subsidy, and overall you might have a better service.
That is the concept.
Yeah.
And so at the moment we are working with our colleagues from ITP to undertake a really deep dive into Cornwall. So what is the status quo, which is the enhanced partnership, what we could potentially do as a hybrid model or go all the way to franchising. And for franchising to work, in my point of view, and for us to be able to do exactly what you said, let's get everything into a pot. We have to have the right conditions for operators who really want to come and compete. We need to have like that environment that everyone can feel like, right, they can invest in Cornwall because I think the return is going to be there. What else can we do for the passenger? What's going to be the benefit? But also the business case has to be sound.
Yeah.
And as a concept, I completely agree with you. If you just like destroy the current network, start from scratch, put everything in the pot, would we have enough money? And the question is, I don't know. And is there a big risk for the local authorities? So that's where, when we talk about franchising, when we talk about better bus bill, etc., the local quirks and the fact that rural areas, you're never going to have that demographic density they're going to make like a network commercial, has to be taken into consideration.
So it's different, because we heard from Manchester that they explained that they felt they had a system that was failing when they inherited it. Whereas what you've got is a system which you're telling us is improving and is respected. It's maybe not perfect, but it's improving. And so for you, franchising would come with risks in terms of cost and actually what the end product would be. Okay, yeah. That's a good counter actually to what we heard earlier.
Yeah, and what I said is what next, isn't it? If I am really honest, there are areas that we would love to take over and have greater ownership, yes. But again, isn't it? It's at what cost? And I think when we really start when we come to the end of this whole process and we really look at what the benefits, the financials, and that's what's going to really, it's going to really give the direction of how far we want to go. So nothing is off the table, and also it was mentioned in the previous session, there is so much uncertainty at the moment with the outcome of the enhanced partnership. It may be that the outcome of this inquiry might make the enhanced partnership fit for purpose. We have the Better Bus Bill. What's going to be, when it becomes primary legislation, what's going to be the impact? So there is so many question marks at the moment, but on the other hand, it's an opportunity for all of us to look at what we're doing and see what we can do better for our passengers.
If I may come in on that, I think if you're looking at the sort of trying to design a network that has the right outcomes, of course you can reinvest profits from profitable routes to sustain others, but the likelihood is in a franchise model that operators are going to be bidding on those routes and building in margin anyway. So I think at somewhat that gets nullified. So it really does come down to the level of investment required for franchising, the broader place-based economics and what you're looking to achieve, and that risk of transition. And that doesn't make it good or bad, it just means that's the equation you're trying to solve.
Yeah, but it's also about the integration piece. I don't know if if the profitable and subsidised service in Cornwall are integrated in terms of people can get on one bus and then change and connect to another one, and bringing it all together into one operation hopefully brings those connections in for people, and it maybe means more people.
Well, I think that's actually a question to ask. Can you go from a subsidised bus to a private, a bus in sort of a different operator in an enhanced partnership?
Absolutely. So if you look at the example, I know Leicester gets quoted a lot, but in Leicester we have multi-operator fare capping, so you can get on and you can tap on any operator's bus and you get it. We have.
That's not necessarily the.
But what we also have is coordinated frequencies.
Yeah.
So on key routes with other operators brokered through the enhanced partnerships, we'll agree to coordinate our frequencies. So the types of things you're talking about, I think, aren't necessarily, you don't need to franchise to achieve them. But of course, if you do, you have more direct control, you can plan that. Yeah. But you take on board the risk of transition and operating it.
Yeah, it sort of swings and
so just to answer the question, interoperability, yes, we have. With regards to network control, the enhanced partnership provides a framework, but we still have some limitations with regard to what's commercially and competitive allowed to do. And as I said, the team does an absolutely amazing job to try to integrate the network, make sure that we have that commercial network and the subsidized come that to fill the gaps, but ends up becoming a bit of like a whack-a-mole when you don't have enough funding.
There's a question about reliability. So can passengers be, under the free-for-all that which we had outside of London, I guess there was a reliability issue, and operators could turn up or not turn up as they felt. Now, obviously, there's a bit more oversight of that, but is there still a risk that the buses might not arrive on time or suddenly change their route? Obviously, for not including emergency and roadworks issues.
There is still a risk, but there's now a mechanism to have that discussion and deal with it, where there wasn't before. And I think also there is that way that you can preempt some of those things as well through the partnership to stop that disruption happening as well.
There's no direct powers.
There's no direct powers,
which is one of the fundamental differences.
Through persuasion.
It's a consultation.
It's a consultation. Okay, Catherine.
So how much does data get shared? So I think that in coming to some of the strategic decisions, when you share data, you can see actually where the gaps are. But in enhanced partnerships, is there a mechanism to be able to have that shared data and then to be able to look at it across different providers?
I think it varies across the country, and it depends on the strength of that relationship, because there was a discussion before about in that framework you can't have data shared, but I know there is a lot of data shared in a lot of areas, which then help develop the services between the commercial providers and the local authorities as well. So I think you can do it through an enhanced partnership, but the bus companies have got to trust the local authority what they're going to use that data for and how they're going to use it for developing services going forward.
It's also very patchy between the different operators, and some of the smaller operators, even with bus open data, the accuracy is quite patchy. So it's harder as you have a wider range of small operators.
Yeah, because I think the concept of data is very, very broad, and I think it depends what data we can have it shared. Some of them use our contracts and other agreements, but if we if we publish the decision to franchise, that's we're going to have like more access to data, and then possibly something that has to be looked at the whole process. Is there any way that local authorities can have access to data earlier in the process?
And in the last 3 to 4 years, the DFT have required enhanced partnerships to look at network sustainability reviews, and I think if you look at the focus at the Centre of Excellence, then again that's potentially an area of focus that can make sure that data is getting shared in a way that is supportive of the objectives of the enhanced partnership.
Collected in a strategic way, so you're actually measuring the same things.
And ultimately, treated in the right way, it's in everybody's interest to do it.
Yeah.
There are commercial sensitivities, but they're not insurmountable.
Alex, did you want to a bit more, any more on the relationships between?
Yeah, I can do that. I also think it might be worth getting on the public record the role of the traffic commissioner, because I think we might have just misleadingly given the impression that you don't need to run your buses on time, whereas
I think we raised 2 points. Really specifically, the traffic commissioner absolutely requires them run on time, monitors us, and in a lot of local authorities we also have data, real-time data that gets monitored, so that we're absolutely there on that. And moreover, it's not just a traffic commissioner, it's the end user. The customer will judge us if we don't run a reliable service, and they won't be as effective. But the other point then around changing services, and then again, via the traffic commissioner, we're required to follow a very strict process of consultation before we change a route, and there's a 12-week lead time. So at that level, the concept there's no control, no, I wouldn't want to give that.
Absolutely. Okay, my actual question then. How have enhanced partnerships led to stronger collaboration between operators and local authorities? And perhaps you could give us a couple of specific examples. Alistair, you just gave us a good one.
I think I'll probably touch on
yours,
my one.
So if anyone else
do.
wants to.
So as I said before, I feel like all the initiatives we have in Cornwall with regards to integration of the network planning. So we have 2 major network changes to take into account of the summer enhancement, and having that coordination of, that's the date that the network change, the information roadside. It sounds very operational, but I think it's just like a reflection of the strategic vision. And I think again that's what the enhanced partnership really allowed parties to come to the table and be able to have these conversations in a protected environment, because before, without the enhanced partnership, there were some commercial sensitivities.
Just building on that, one thing many of our enhanced partnerships is just that coordination of service change. So historically, operators might have done them on different dates, but just in the enhanced partnership, aligning them so they all take place on the same date gives that certainty of it kind of being one network.
I think it's really good to try and help and develop smaller operators as well through the partnership, and we've got a lot of issues in a lot of areas where we've got those operators that are giving up, and we're struggling to get that new generation coming through to provide it, so we can help those operators develop and maybe get into running local bus services where they haven't done before. So that can be a real positive.
And then, relationships between different types of councils as well, because obviously we've got situations where you've got one council that's the Transport Authority and another council that's the Highways Authority, and this is actually going to become an increasingly bigger problem as more MCAs are rolled out. What role does enhanced partnerships have of bringing councils of different types together as well?
I think it will become more crucial, because you'll have more authorities where the Highway Authority is different from the Transport Authority, and there's a real concern. We've got a real concern about losing that transport coordination, because some responsibilities will be with the combined authority and some remain, like for school transport, with the council. So we're trying to look at how we can come up with some guidance on how we can make that work in the future model to try and keep that integration together. Because we, as I said before, we spend a significant amount of money in many areas delivering things like school transport. We don't want to lose that integration that then costs us more with a combined authority making a decision about how they run their buses. So it's trying to think about how we can retain that model.
We with our neighbouring STBs in Transport East and Transport South East brought all the enhanced partnership chairs together to talk about what needed to happen to kind of strengthen enhanced partnerships. And certainly where there is a political leader of an enhanced partnership, that which of course then that political leader will often be on the on the combined authority board, if in those in devolved areas, it does allow that greater alignment between the combined authority and the enhanced partnership in that region. The other thing that we haven't kind of explored is cross-boundary, where you have an enhanced partnership in one authority, perhaps really well funded, and then neighbouring authority, which has happened a lot with BSIP funding, and the ability of one authority to deliver really strong performance improvements, and then just over the border that not be available has been a really big issue. It's being normalised, but there's been a lot of catching up to do from the first round of BSIP.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back to this almost elephant in the room, which is funding. And I mean, even in London, our buses are cross-subsidised from the tube network. I understand that EPs have the power to, for their authorities to be able to raise precepts, and even parish councils can raise precepts. To what extent are you using your ability, or your authority's ability, to raise precepts to help fund buses?
There's a lot of local authorities that still generate their own revenue funding that goes into the local bus network. I'm not aware of any that have actually generated additional money through a specific precept through the EP, but the bus funding across local authorities is made up of a mix of revenue funding from the council. Section 106 for developments is quite important as well as the money for it. So it's a constant jigsaw that's changing, because you're trying to see what's happening to all those different pots of money for the next financial year and then the financial year afterwards.
Yeah, similar for us, our local transport budget is funded by the core budget of the council. We try to get a bit of a Section 106 and other contributions, income, BC, bus fare pilots. But yeah, it's core funding from the council. Especially as a unitary authority, it becomes a bit easier in some ways and harder in others. Okay,
which leads us on to Catherine's question.
Yes, and we've talked a little bit already about the difficulties around cross-subsidisation, but the government's buses bill proposes to widen the definition of socially necessary services within enhanced partnerships, and I was wondering what the implications of a service being designated as socially necessary, what that will look like.
Yeah, so I think as a concept we can all agree that it's really good when primary legislation recognizes the importance of local bus service as a guarantee of human rights, and should access to public transport be a human right in itself. But when you start reading the narrative of the Better Bus Bill, it's very similar to the operating model we already have in Cornwall. We have the commercial run services, and when they are withdraw or reduces, if there is no other commercial interest, the local authority decides to step in or not. If I am open and honest about the way I see the bill, I feel there are it can be a bit vague about what socially necessary means. And I am an example. I live 5-6 miles away from my employer and 7 miles away from my hospital, and I do not have a direct bus. I can do that journey, yes, but if I was a 90-year-old woman, I wouldn't be able to do that without other aids. So I feel the whole idea, and I think Damien and we had a chat before about putting that burden into the local authority, unless it's something extremely objective and say this is a scientific definition, there is no room for interpretation. It can create another burden in local authorities, and a situation like home to school, when we have that range of statutory obligations that we are struggling to afford. So as a concept, it's really good, but if this is going to be going ahead for work for local authorities, there has to be an understanding that some of the services, they're going to be carrying fresh air most of the time, but they are still socially necessary. And to what point the local authority says, I just cannot afford that. But if it's a statutory responsibility, we're going to have to find a way.
You'd like to see stronger definitions of socially necessary?
Stronger definition if possible. It's my birthday, so I'm going to ask my wishes. Stronger definition if possible. Funding for local authorities as well. I think it has to be really defined there, but also I think greater clarity about what's going to be the burden and the flexibility that the local authority will have.
Can I add one more wish to that, which is alignment with land use planning and other policy decisions outside of the Department for Transport, ultimately, particularly with buses. The social benefits of them are often not transport benefits, and it comes back to the kind of integrated national transport strategy and the fact that we need to, how we look at transport appraisal for socially necessary services is very, very different from whether you might do it from a transport perspective, and those decisions from other departments is really important.
Damien.
Working with the LGA, we've got concerns about the need to produce a list that if you get to a point where that money runs out and then you've defined it as socially necessary, how do you then remove that service when you're trying to reduce your budgets, if that's the issue? So
isn't that part of the benefit? I think certainly in circumstances where in the East Midlands we've seen such a huge reduction, more than anywhere else, of the number of bus routes. If the point is to try and actually stop so many people being cut off from the ability to access services that they really need, then isn't that really partly the point?
Is a benefit, but then you've got to have the money to pay for it, and if it becomes an obligation on the council to pay for that, then that is an issue alongside social care, education, all those other services that you have to deliver. So it's perfect if the funding is available. If it's not, it becomes a very difficult issue to do it. We were looking at whether you have more build on it to have more transparency and accountability in how you make decisions about what services you support or not, and have some kind of assessment of it rather than it just being a list. Show a bit more about how you've come to those decisions of what you will support and what you won't.
And also maybe separate it. There's a definition of what is socially necessary, and clearly the government has stated also that they want to allocate funding based on place-based needs and levels of deprivation, which we absolutely welcome. But also the definition of service, so what service is provided, because we've alluded to empty buses. That's probably not the right answer for anybody in a limited funding situation. So what type of service? Is it a taxi service? Is it access to some other form of transportation?
Alex, did you want to come in?
Is there a danger that by having the list of socially necessary services, that what actually happens is that the services that could be enhanced, which has happened through various pots like BSIP, are no longer enhanced by transport authorities? So therefore you don't, I mean, we've talked before about the fact that there has been a decline in high frequency services. So rather than using the money to create high frequency, you're just using the money for, as you were talking about, buses running around empty.
I think there's a risk that happens, absolutely.
I think in some areas that will be happening already, so that what you are using your BSIP allocation for the next financial year is to maintain your network in the first instance, which then reduces the amount of funding you've got to develop and enhance services.
Should there therefore be a necessity at the same time as producing a list of socially necessary, of producing a list of potential necessary high frequency, because otherwise aren't we in a decline?
And through the partnership in Devon, that's what we've done, and Norfolk have been particularly successful in that, in enhancing the best services, which then increase the passengers, and they then become commercially viable, which then means the local authority and the partnership can move on to the next level down to improve them. So it does work.
Which brings you back to the quality of the bus service improvement plan, that it's got to be a 3 to 5 year ambitious network plan.
I think the concept works, but also, if you're very honest with ourselves, I think sometimes trying to encourage people to public transport, and the conversation we had before, requires behavior change, but also other interventions. And I think whatever we are doing, be it with franchise, enhanced partnership, better bus bill, there has to be that holistic approach. It's not only telling people, right, you need to get your bus because that's good for the environment or that's good for the public purse, but also what other interventions we can make best use, such as like restrictions on parking, bus priorities, and how we can actually promote that behavior change. And it's not going to be something that's going to be solved in 1, 2, 3, 4 years. It's going to have to be a long journey. And the example I always use is around recycling. I think we all, when we started recycling how many years ago, we're just like, what is that? And now it's became such a part of our days by day, we don't even think twice. And I think that's how we need to start looking at the future of how we want people to travel. Movement needs to happen. People are going to have to move from A to B. But how we can make it like in a way that everyone thinks about public transport first. And going back to what I said before, is the investment. how we need to start framing that. So I think there are lots of great ideas here, and I think it's lots of great opportunities. But
okay, thank you. We need to close very shortly, so I'm going to give you all a chance to very briefly answer the question: what are the most important things that would increase bus ridership and coverage outside urban areas?
Funding and bus priority, I think, as well, particularly for going from the rural into the urban.
Alistair?
Yeah. Punctuality, reliability, frequency, so it's a combination of funding and also bus priority measures.
Okay. Naomi?
I think information provision, making things clear, both digital and for those who aren't digitally able.
Funding, investment, and supporting legislation.
And I'll add time. That was a point you made very strongly just then. Thank you ever so much. If there's anything you think that you want to add that we didn't say, then, and particularly, sorry, there is a final question, but I think I've got to go on. I'm going to ask a lot. Sorry, there was a supplementary. What do you need in order to make those changes that you've just outlined quickly back down? What's needed?
I think that's what we want, isn't it? Greater... For me, from Cornwall Council point of view, it's like a greater understanding of what a rural authority is and some of the buses that we run, because we are really...
Better understanding within the DFT about the challenges. Yeah.
I think from all the decision makers and lawmakers, because when we're sitting here, we look outside, you see that happening, but in a rural area, it's completely different.
Better understanding. Anything? What else? What's needed to happen to get those changes?
Without a shadow of doubt, all of the EP conversations we've had have identified long-term funding settlements. That's not necessarily always more. It's certainty of funding so that decisions can be made on how to use it. And I think alignment with other government departments' decisions is absolutely critical.
Time and certainty to allow long-term view.
Okay. I think it's knowing that there's different models available in different areas. It's sort of, a lot of the focus is on the big city metropolitan areas, but there's a lot of opportunity.
Which is why we had this inquiry.
So it's why we've got a really good opportunity to do a lot of different things.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you very much. As I say, do let us have any additional evidence that you feel you didn't get a chance to cover or you haven't already included in your written evidence. And I'd like to thank you very much for the time today and for the evidence you've already sent. It's been really informative. I think we found it very useful. We will continue collecting evidence as we progress. This concludes today's meeting. Order, order.